In a certain sense, this week's Parsha is a challenge. It's different. The texture is different. Of all the episodes that take place in the book of Bamidbar, again, there are a lot of Bamidbar episodes. This one is different. The main reason is because we're in the background, and one can almost say that we're unaware of what's taking place. We're just going about living our lives, doing our thing, and there is this plot to get rid of us, which is really frightening, because one wonders in terms of history, how many times is God there in the background? We're foiling all kinds of plans and plots and ideas that people have. The Chazal say that when it comes to people who have the ability of impacting history, then God micromanages on a different level than he sometimes deals with us in our lives. And therefore, if there's something which is very, very big, then God has the prerogative of always getting involved in history and doing what God feels needs to be done. Not that I can interpret any more than this, especially this week's Parsha. Rabbi Lichtenstein was very fond of citing this week's Parsha regarding people who always knew exactly what God was doing and why he was doing it and why things happened. And he would quote, "You don't understand your donkey, right? And you understand God? Like please, let's have a little bit of humility." So let's getting back to our place over here. This idea that there is this divine protection, this ananei kavod, as it were, but throughout history, whereby there are these people who plot the worst possible things, and somehow they get frustrated along the way and they don't take place. So I'm saying that to me is part of what's really interesting about this. And maybe in a certain sense we see it more than other places. I would have liked there to be a little bit more of divine protection and Hashgacha Pratit and taking care of Moshe Rabbeinu, stopping him from the whole episode with the rock. But maybe that's exactly the point. When it comes to leaders, HaKadosh Baruch Hu decides who's going to be the leader. He decides when it's time for one to step aside and when it's time for someone else to take over, and what people need at that particular sense. So what I want to do this morning is I want to start off by going slow and reading pasuk after pasuk and trying to figure out what's happening. I mean, the first thing which is intriguing, which is what's not here, and that is why the Archbishop of Canterbury decided that we should start over here with the previous pasuk, why the chapter begins with the previous verse, and maybe we'll come back to that, which means over here we're starting pasuk bet, not pasuk aleph. Again, this doesn't say that much about us, but it says more about him, why he thought that was really the introduction to this chapter. So maybe we'll have time to try to understand, say, a svara in the Archbishop as well, and to understand where that was coming from. Vayar Balak ben Tzipor et kol asher asa Yisrael le'emori. We have right there three protagonists that we were introduced to in one verse. Working backwards, we have the Amori, we have Yisrael, and then we have Balak. And the thing which is interesting about Balak is that here's a character being introduced that we have no idea who he is. Generally, when a character is going to be introduced, you're going to give a little bit of background, a little information, and we're going to say, oh, so-and-so, but here just Balak ben Tzipor, and all of us, okay, Balak ben Tzipor, no, ma'achbatli, miyata b'chlal, right? What does that make any difference to us? And then it continues and it says, Vayagar Moav mipnei ha'am ma'od ki ravhu. And Moav was I'm not sure how to translate any of this, lots of words in this week's Parsha which are hard to translate. And they were very disturbed by the people because they were so numerous. And I want to stop there mid-verse. So a fourth protagonist potentially is introduced, and that's Moav. Of course, now we're going to very soon have the temptation to connect Balak to Moav. But what's interesting is the anonymity of the Am. And I know you can tell me it's just, when you're writing, it's a turn of phrase. Vayagar Moav pnei ha'am ma'od ki ravhu. That sounds to be a fear that there are people there and they are very afraid of them because there is this whole influx of population and it's standing there and it's frightening them. And then you have the comment on that, V'yikatz Moav b'bnei b'nei Israel. And then Israel, as being the objective of this hatred or this, whatever you want to call it, is mentioned. So even though that is, as of this point, we have Balak, and we have Israel, and we have the Amori, and then we have Moab, and we have the Am, and I know that I have too many characters, right, and we're going to have to fit some into the others, but it is interesting the different way that they are described. And then, if that's not enough, we then get another group added, Vayomer Moab El Ziknei Midian. So Moab then speaks to, now who in Moab? Moab. Right? Moab speaks to the elders. By the way, for that verse to have been a little bit more fair, it should have said, the elders of Moab spoke to the elders of Midian. So there is some disparity over here, which is a little strange. Vayomer Moab El Ziknei Midian. And they said, where did Midian come from? And what's Midian doing here at all? And one of the things that, of course, you should do is you should look up on a map and try to see where all these people are. And Midian is no place near all of this. If you can imagine Israel, and I'm including everything on one side of the Jordan, right? I know for some of you I should include both sides of the Jordan, and maybe we'll get back to that. But let's call Israel proper, including what some call the whole West Bank, but Israel proper, which is all on one side of the Jordan, and then you have on the other side of the Jordan, which is, and really down below, south, which is where Moab is, down the south. As you get a little bit further north, we're going to get into some of our intrigue, but now if you go further east, which is no place near all of this, on the other side, let's say of Jordan, or past Jordan, going past there, that's where you're going to first find Midian. So Midian is not in the path. Midian has nothing to do with all of this. And it continues, says that Moab says the elders of Midian. So just even to put it that way, it seems to be that when it comes to Moab, there is this national panic. When it comes to what do we do with the national panic, then we turn to leaders in Midian. And now what's going to happen with the leaders of Midian, or what's going to be the conversation with them? And by the way, when I said that they are further, they also may come further down south, which will explain why certain things happen, including when Moshe runs away from Egypt. That's where he gets to. And they say to the Vayoma Moab Ziknei Midian, Ata Yilach Lechu HaKahal, now they're described as a Kahal, Et Kol Sibivotenu, Ki Lechol Chashor Et Yerek HaSadeh. They're going to swallow, eat everything up, right? Like a bull swallows the vegetation that grows in the field. By the way, it's a very important pasuk that, right, bulls eat vegetation. So if anybody ever asks me if I'm a vegetarian, I'm a vegetarian cliché-ny, right? Of course it does. You are what you eat, right? Anyway, so notice a couple things. One is when the Meraglim come back, they say, we're like grasshoppers in their eyes, right? And over here, we're like this big, powerful bull, which is not exactly the same as a grasshopper. So that itself is really interesting. And the other thing is, did you notice the total, again, same word, anonymity? They don't mention who these people are. I mean, the same way that the first half of Pasuk Gimel had said, "Vayigar Moab bnei ha'am ma'od," and over here it says they send their message, and their message, Ata yilachachu hakahal et kol sevivotenu. Who's the kahal? I mean, normally when you're talking about politics, geopolitics, and so on, you want to talk about who these people are and what the strategy is. It's always going to come down to a couple of things. What is their objective, and what is their secondary objective? Can we practically placate? Can we join forces with them? I mean, there's all kinds of other discussions that should take place. But instead, what's being mentioned over here, and it's already happened twice, and there is this anonymous mob which is coming who are very powerful, and we need to do something about them. So I'm saying this itself is fascinating. Maybe this should remind you, again, you could choose, which one. The first thing comes to my mind will be Haman when he's trying to sell to Achashverosh to eradicate the Jews. He also calls them this Am Mifuzar Mufurad Beina Amim, and you kind of wonder about the political capabilities of Achashverosh, because instead of just saying, "Oh, you're paying, let's get rid of all of them," who are these people? What can we do? Can we co-opt them? Can we make them people who believe in us, people who support us, and so on? I'm just saying there's total lack. And again, you could accuse me of having 20th century sensibilities in terms of an analysis of political realities. But nonetheless, even if you're talking about going to war, wouldn't you want to know who you're going to war against? Who are these people? What exactly is their interest? And that would require a little bit more information. Now, on the other hand, and the only reason I mention this is because a good friend and long-time listener emailed me earlier in the week, and he asked me, what do we know about the background of the whole story? So I sent him 3 different shurim I gave about the background of the story, but obviously it wasn't enough, so this one is for Richie. Okay? So I'm going to do it again. I'm going to do it more in depth, and we're going to hopefully finally make it work. But one thing that we need to keep in mind, and that is, should we pick on your grandson or not, is the common denominator. What is the common denominator between Moab and Midian? There is a common denominator between them, and what is it? And no, we're picking on him now, yeah?
He and the Jews.
See? I see he's your grandson now.
What did he say?
He said they both hate the Jews. The common denominator is actually Avram Avinu. Right? And you're looking at me like, what am I talking about? Because Midian is the son of Avraham, one of the Bnei Keturah, and Moab is the child of Avraham's nephew Lot. So therefore, they both come from the common denominator. You want to go a little further back? They both come from TORAH. You want to go a little bit further back? They both come from Shem. That itself is really important. But even though you're just going straight to the anti-Semite, thing, who are they? They hate us. But you can say it about everybody. Who are they? They hate us. They hate us. They all hate us. They all hate us. Some let us know they hate us. Some don't tell us they hate us. So I'm with you completely on that. But again, there's a little bit more interesting historical background. And by the way, I would love to know something else, because part of what we're going to see is, as we move on, is there seems to be a total lack of historical understanding, essentially about what has happened in the background and why we are where we are, how we got to. Let me put it this way. I would say that there's this total lack of biblical history, which it's okay. They didn't go to Cheder. I'm fine with this. That the people from Moab, people from Midian, they didn't go to Cheder, so therefore they don't know the whole story. But I also wonder something else. What is the Masorah that they've received? Which means, what is their personal knowledge, or what's the narrative that they have somehow picked up along the way? So that to me is really interesting. And do they have the same one? Is the narrative which Midian is walking around with is the same narrative which Moab is walking around with? And how does this come, how does this deal? Balaam, we haven't even gotten to him yet. I mean, right, he's part of the problem here. But what are their stories? So when this conversation takes place, whenever we hear information, it fits into information we already know. Right? That's how we process. We hear something, and then we fit in something we know, and then we try to put it into a particular category. We have a whole bunch of different categories in our heads, and then you hear something, and now where do you put it? So therefore, when Moab sees this whole group, okay, what are they saying? When Moab comes over to Midian and says, oh, these people are coming over here, so what are they hearing? Which means, what's taking place? And to what extent do any of them know the same biblical stories that we know, or are they completely oblivious to them? To our stories, and therefore they live their stories. They have their narratives and so on. And that, of course, is the big problem in human history, is that people have competing narratives. And how do you deal with competing narratives? Correct? Correct. So, what are we up to? We're only up to Pasuk Daled, and these people are coming. And then the end of Pasuk Daled, Balak ben Sipor melech l'Moav be'etahi. And Balak ben Sipor was the king of Moab at that time. And all of us should be sensitive that it should have been the other way around. Vayar Balak, the very beginning, which should be Pasuk Aleph, right? The very beginning should have said, and Balak ben Sipor melech Moab, and then meaning, why is he introduced at this point? Which leads the Midrashim and the commentaries in all kinds of different places. Some of them say that he himself was not really from Moab, that he's really from Midian, and that's part of that Moab-Midian connection. Some say that he wasn't king and he wasn't necessarily from royalty, and rather, this is going to be the plan out of many people's playbook, he uses the anti-Semitism, he uses the threat of the Jews who are taking over to propel his political career until the point that he's the one who's most sensitive to this threat which is coming, and that's how he becomes king at that point. So meaning they'll read it like this, Ubalak ben Sipor melech Moab be'etahi. and then he was king, but he wasn't king beforehand. So as I said, this verse is a problem, or this half of verse is a problem. How the second half of the verse connects to the first half of the verse is possibly a solution, but this is a problem, how you read this. Vayishlach melachim el Bil'am ben Ba'or Pitorah asher al hanahar eretz b'nei amo l'krolo. Now, how much of this was helpful in having any understanding who Bil'am is and where he's from? Asher al hanahar eretz b'nei amo. Did that help you? Okay, it didn't help me either. I know more about Bilam not because of this verse, but because of looking at other places where there's more information giving about Bilam, including very famously archaeological information about Bilam is also known. As of this moment, I have no idea who he is. I will tell you something that the Zohar intuits about. It says that if you take Bilam and you take Balak and you put those letters together, you end up with Amalek. Right? Right, so Bilam, and by the way, it could be that Balak's not so bad, or doesn't seem so good, and Bilam is not so bad, and he doesn't seem so good. But that happens sometimes also. You put two people together, right? Bilam, the Am in Bilam and Balak, you put them together, and suddenly Amalek emerges, and that's not a good thing, because Amalek, we're back to you again, they don't like us. And by the way, they're also related to us. They're also family. So, let's now try to make some sense of this and try to move on. V'yishlach melachim el Bil'am ben Ba'or Pitorah asher al nahar eretz b'nei amo l'krolo lemor hine am yatsa mitzrayim hine kisa et ein haaretz v'hu yoshev mimuli. And what's missing? Who is this Am Yotzei mitzrayim? Which means the same way that, again, you could decide if this is... You'll make your decisions now. Is this simply a lack of knowledge? They don't know who these people are? Obviously they do. You know why I say that? Look at the little information I did give just now. Am Yotza Mitzrayim. Here is a group of people that left Egypt. Well, it means that they have enough information that they know they left Egypt. I don't know what to say. I know that you can all now create various scenarios. They heard Egyptian dialects. I'm not saying anything else. I'm just saying that what's not here is really interesting because it's not the first time it's not here in these couple of verses. In Pasuk Gimel it was Vayigar Moav B'nei Ha'am Ma'od, and again you had that in anonymity until that second half of the pasuk. And then when Moav sends the message to Midian, right? Hakal Hazeh. They just mentioned without saying who they are, and now sending the message to Bilam. What do they say? Am Yatzam Mitzrayim. So I don't know about you, but for me, 3 times in a row to make reference. And by the way, the first one I would have ignored. I do want you to understand that. I would have ignored the first one. And I would have read the second part of the verse and interpreted the first part of the verse on that. It's only after the subsequent 2 more times that we find that Israel's not mentioned by name that I begin to suspect that there's something else going on over here because there's not even a willingness of saying who they are. Now, why is that? Which means, where is this coming from that you have this total fear? Again, he'll tell us exactly what they want in a moment, but they're not even willing to acknowledge who they are. Who's they? Which they? The whole world. I'm going to say it again. Balak, whoever he is communicating, and all his communications, he chooses not to mention who this other nation is. And I hope that you appreciate that's completely bizarre. That's just not the way that this should be. Because especially, if I would have asked you a simple question, who is it that Balak wants to get rid of? And you all would have said Israel, and I would have said, well, how do you know? And you would have found that really annoying on my part, right? When I said, how do you know? And you said, well, it's Israel. I said, well, how do you know it's Israel? It doesn't say it's Israel. I understand. So that is one of the subtexts that the commentaries suggest. If you want, we can look at the Rashi that'll say that, but I'd rather read on a little bit more. But yes, you certainly could say that. So, and that is the question we always ask in Bamidbar, that how people are described on, and that's why this is really perplexing over here. Correct? 100%. 100%. That is part of our... Correct. So as I said, I'm with you 100%, and That's what we need to note. Answers, no, mi yodea. Let's read a little bit more. So they send this message to this person, Balaam, who again we don't know all that much about. A people left Egypt, and I'll say it again. You don't know who these people are? And you know what all my passive aggression is really about, is do you know about the Brit Bein Abtarim? That's really the point. Which means we know about the Brit Bein Abtarim. As far as we're concerned, the Brit Bein Abtarim is the most important statement in the whole book of Bereshit, because it gives us information to understand where we're going in all of Shemot and all of Bamidbar and all of Devarim, which means that's the guidepost, right? That tells us exactly where we are, where we're going, how we got here, and so on. That the Brit Bein Abtarim is the prophecy. Do they know about it? Do they know about this? Because they do know about this, then there's some interesting things that probably could be said over here. And you noticed along the way that I also skipped one important thing, and we didn't pay that much of attention to it. And what was that? What did we skip? Back in Pasuk Bet, where it says, Vayar Balak ben Kol Asher Asa Yisrael le'emori. Why is the emori important? Which means, are we waking up yet? Why are the emori important? Rabbi Zach is going to tell you why. Why are they important? Because they're mentioned in the Brit Bein Abtarim. So therefore, if that's what I'm keeping in mind as far as where we are, where we're going to, and what's going on, that's a really important piece of information. You know, what is said there. So let's go a little bit further. We get to Balaam. We're in the second half of Pasuk Hey. I told you we're going very slow today. Hine am yatzah miMitzrayim. Hine kisad eina aretz v'yoshev mimuli. Okay. Tzeder. Now continue. Va'ata l'chana arali et ha'am hazeh. Curse for me this people or this nation. Ha'am hazeh, they want cursed. Ki yatzum mimeni, because they are more numerous than I am. So part of it sounds like a numbers game, which is part of the fear from the very beginning. Look how many of them are. Ulai uchal nakebo, and then perhaps I can strike him. The word nakeh is interesting. I can strike him. I don't know how far we'll get today, but that word or derivations of it will come multiple times in terms of the next couple scenes later when we get to Bilam and his donkey in terms of striking the donkey. That's going to come up there as well. That's not an accident. Ulai uchal nakebo va'agrashenu min haaretz, and I'll chase him away from the land. Ki yadati et asher tivarech muvarach v'asher ta'or you are, because I know whoever you blessed is blessed, and whoever you curse is cursed. So it's at this point we're now a little bit more perplexed, and I go back to all the questions I've already asked, and I want to know what does he know in terms of his biblical knowledge? What does he know in terms of Sefer Bereshit? Which means there are people that whoever blesses them is blessed and whoever curses them is cursed. There are people like this, but he seems to have gotten the address wrong in terms of who he's addressing as far as that goes. So that itself, causes a bit of a question. Or on the other hand, he may very well know that the Jewish people have this ability, or at least this reputation, that whoever blesses them is blessed, whoever curses them is cursed. And by the way, it's interesting. By the Jews, whoever blesses them is blessed, whoever curses them is cursed. Over here is whoever you bless is blessed, whoever you curse is cursed. And maybe this is coming from a precise knowledge about what took place in Bereshit, but it needs to be countered. Now, there's a second thing over here that I want to pay attention to, is notice what his objective is. There's a lot of them. I want to go to war against them. I want to defeat them, and I need a little help. So first of all, it's really interesting that he's going to the type of a help which is based upon non-conventional warfare. Okay, let's call it that. He seems to know it's non-conventional warfare which is necessary. But there is something already which is missing, and it's going to continue to be missing as we move on. And the only question will be is how many pieces of proof I'm going to need to bring to this. Should I tell you what's missing, or you want to figure it out yourselves? So lazy. What's missing? God. It's not that God will curse them. It's not that God will bless. It's that you have the ability. And notice that God is not here over at all. So that's interesting, because how does somebody now have knowledge of biblical stories, but you took God out of the biblical stories? That itself is fascinating. But that's part of what's taking place over here. And the elders of Moab and the elders of Midian. Now pay attention, because we're about to lose one of them, right? And they go, uksamim biyadam. What's ksamim? They're bringing their magic, which seems to be that they're going to somebody who is actually talented in the occult, somebody whose power comes from magic and the occult. Again, as opposed to God, we're told various times not to do things like this, like ksamim, which means this is like almost like a total counter. And if you really need, we can look. We have someplace here a pasuk that actually calls Balaam a kosem. I mean, he is called a kosem. So one wonders who he is and what he is, or what he can really do, what he can't do. And let's keep another thing in mind. Just because somebody hired a PR firm and says certain things about them, I mean, I don't know if any of you are in places like LinkedIn and so on. So the other day somebody asked to connect, and they described themselves as a world thought leader. How do you even make things like this up? I mean, how many thoughts do you need, and how many people need to follow you? Like, you have 4 people, you're now a world thought leader. Is that all that you need? So over here, I don't know how. I don't know what it said on Balaam's LinkedIn account. I don't know how he described himself, but so far he's got this street rep, right? He's got street cred. As what? As well, whoever he blesses is blessed, whoever curses is cursed. And we're told that that's the message which is being sent. Who sends the message? Let's be very careful now as we read this again. We're going to go backwards a little bit. We're going to go back to pasuk Hey. V'yishlach malachim el Balaam, right? And then pasuk Vav. Curse them. Ulai uchal nakeh. Ki yadati et asher tavrech merech. Now, we're not sure exactly how that was introduced. Vayilchu ziknei Moab v'ziknei Midian uksamim b'yadam v'yaviu Balaam v'yadibur elav divrei Balak. So they said what Balak had said. So again, my only question is, and I think the odds are that the answer is yes. Did they say Balak said? By the way, if that's the case, then what do you need the ziknei Midian for? Which means that just send them. And why you need the Ziknei Binyan gets more interesting as we continue. And he says, Vayomer leim linu po halayla. He says, spend the night here. Vashivot yatchem davar kasher yidaber Hashem elai. Spend the night, and I will then tell you what God will say to me. Now, do we have any reason to believe that God has ever spoken to him until this point? I'm just saying, do we have any reason? The only reason we have reason to believe it is because of him. Do we have any reason to believe what he says? Which means, would we suspect that he is this kind of character, that when he says God said something, then God said something, he said God said something to him? And also notice something else. Here is where God gets introduced into the story. Who introduced him? Balaam, and says, God's going to speak to me. Now, there are 2 people in this parsha that you can't trust when they speak, on their own at least. One is Balak and the other is Balaam, because they're both quite manipulative, and they deserve one another. We just have to keep them away from one another. And he says, whatever God will tell me. And notice he uses the name Hashem, Yud-Kei, Vav-Kei, V'yishvu sarei Moab el Balaam, and therefore the ministers of Moab, they V'yishvu sarei in Balaam. They stay with Balaam, as opposed to, it says, V'yilchu ziknei Moab and ziknei Midian, and now the sarei Moab stay, which means somehow the ziknei, they're turned into the sarei, from elders to ministers. And the other thing is that the elders of Midian seem to disappear, which they can also, again, commentaries are going to do all kinds of things here, including him saying, he just now mentioned God. Now, we've mentioned God, that why is God being mentioned? I just want to go back to the biblical story issue or side of all of this, which means, do any of these people know in the back of their minds that we are talking about the Jews, and the Jews have been blessed, and the Jews have a mission, and there is this Brit Bein HaBetarim, and there is this manifest destiny. And once the counter now is going to be, okay, let me see what God has to say about it, they're saying, what do you mean what God has to say about it? If that's the question over here, we're out of here. Which means, did Midian just now say that if God is brought into the story, we are leaving the story right now because this is not going to be successful? So, and again, they do have less skin in the game because what do they have to do with all of this? It's not their land. It's not them. They were just dragged into it, and how they got dragged into it goes back to our previous question: who is Balak? Is he one of the Midianite guys who now was able to leverage his hatred of the Jews into become the leader of Moab by creating this mass hysteria? Because, by the way, a little bit more biblical knowledge would have saved them. But instead, it gets turned into this mass hysteria, and the other people from Midian say, like, what in the world are you talking about? And we're not staying, but they disappear, and they're out of the. They're no longer in the story from here till almost the very end, when some girl from Midian shows up at the end of the story. So, how did that happen, or why does that happen? So that's interesting. But I'm just saying that that's a part of their leaving right now. And by the way, when does she show up? Okay, maybe we'll get the back there. Okay, so let's try to proceed. Spend the night. Vayavo Elokim el Bilam. So as much as Bilam said that Hashem's going to reveal to me, Hashem Yud Kei Vav Kei, right? Instead, Elokim comes to him, which is Midat Hadin. So don't miss that, because there's a difference over there. And again, is this something he's expecting, or is this something like essentially saying to himself, these are the Jews, and if these are the Jews, I know my stories. And you have this other whole background to this, where, right, you know that Chazal say that he may have been one of the advisors of Paro, so that means he's dealt with them before, especially according to that Midrash, and he's saying, I'm not going there again, that this does not work out all that well. But either way, his hesitation or his willingness now to only do what God says, is that who he is? Or is that because now he understands who the adversary is? We'll see something about his monotheism in a couple of minutes, hopefully. So continue. Vayavo Elokim el Bilam, vayomer mi anashem ela imach. Who are these people with you? Vayomer Bilam ela Elokim. By the way, now he answers Elokim, as opposed to him claiming the Yud Kei Vav Kei. Balak ben Sipor melech Moab shalach elai. And he says, Chazal point out with a point of pride, look how important I am. Kings are coming to me for consultations. So, but notice, what was God's? Notice here constantly question and answer, right? Vayavo Elokim el Bilam mi ha'anashim ha'ela imach. Who are these people, and what does he say? Balak ben Melech Moab shalach elai. Is that really the answer of who these people are? By the way, you would like, and it's close. It's close. But if you really do believe in God and God is really asking you a question, I would absolutely advise to answer with precision, and he doesn't. He does not.
He sees as himself.
Correct. And you're going to see now how manipulative he is, which he's going to get some midah keneged midah as we proceed. Hinei ha'am hayotzei miMitzrayim v'yichasete in ha'aretz atalacha kavali oto v'la yochal lihilachem bo. Notice that the what was the word used before? It was to strike before nakeh. Now nakeh becomes lihilachem. It's a little. It is a little bit softer. So he's telling over what it is. But again, the fact that he's not being precise, I think, is to be expected. Very garish tiv. Vayomer Elokim el Bilam. Now let's count. Number one, lo telech imahem. By the way, is that clear enough? Do not go with them. 2, lo ta'ara ta'am. 2, do not curse these people. 3, ki baruchu, because they are blessed. So now, remember I told you before, you can't trust Bilam when he's talking? Vayakam Bilam baboker, vayomol sarei Balak, l'chu el artzachem, ki ma'in Hashem. By the way, he just switched from El Hashem. He went back to Hashem, which what he had claimed from the beginning. Ki ma'in Hashem l'tite lochi machem, because God is not letting me go with you. Did he happen to have mentioned the other 2 points? Right? What was the second point? The first point was don't go. Second point is don't curse them. And third is they are blessed. Now, if he would have mentioned those other 2 points, which, by the way, I'm going to say it again, go absolutely back to our Breshit narrative in terms of when Avram first makes his journey, which is not perhaps a dissimilar journey from the one that Bilam takes, traveling the same kind of path. And God says that, whoever, you are blessed, and whoever blesses you will be blessed, and cursed, and so on. Vayakam Bilam baboker, vayomos harelak, right? Pasuk Yudalad. Vayikumu sarei Moab, Vayavo el Balak, Vayomu me'en Balaam halochimanu. He refuses to come with us. What did they do again? It's not the first time. What did they do again? They removed God from the narrative. Which means from the Moab side, God is not part of the story. Balaam has the ability to curse. Right? They bring the Ksamim, a cult. Even when he says, let me go to sleep and see what God says, they are disinterested in this. And what's the bottom line that they hear? Not that God said you can't go, that he refuses to go. So it's also interesting how people are processing the information which is coming to them. But again, God is not part of their story. And that's part of what we need to ask ourselves. Again, why not? Why not? Which means, go back to Moab. And who does Moab come from? Moab comes from Lot. And did Lot ever teach his kids? And yes, Lot's family life is complicated. I do understand that. Did Lot ever teach his kids about Abraham? Did he ever teach them about God? And by the way, could there be anger towards Abraham? We know that Lot leaves Abraham and he sees what to him is the Garden of Eden, and he goes and he ends up moving to stone. And what always strikes us as somewhat unfortunate is the man who's living with the greatest person who had ever lived till that point, and maybe in all of world's history, and he leaves him to become, a judge in the city of stone. I mean, again, there's just something missing in that story. So, but how does he tell it over to his kids? And maybe something else that bothers them is, why does old stone get destroyed? Where was the great Avraham? Why couldn't Avraham protect us? By the way, that itself could be interesting from their perspective. Where was Avraham? And apparently, right, I don't know if you like this question at all. When Lot's daughters say, there's nobody else around to be with us, why do they never consider the possibility that Avraham survived the apocalypse? Right? Is that a fair question? Is Lot the only person? Lot's the only tzaddik in the world? Did Lot never say anything about Avram Avinu? I'm just saying, if he did say something about Avram Avinu, why in the world would they think that Avraham's not around at all? That Avram's not alive? That there's somebody else over here, at least somebody else. Who knows, who else there may be. There is at least one of the Mefarshim who says that when Eliezer or the Eved Avram goes and he meets with Lot and so on and about Rivka and says, if you don't listen, I'm going to go Yaminu Small, and he says, one of the possibilities, I'll go find Benot Lot. Right? Which is some of us they weren't the nicest girls, but still, no, there are other options out there. But I'm saying from the other perspective, what is the narrative in the Moab family? What do they know about Avram? What do they know about Yitzchak? What do they know about any of this? Or that's it. They left before the Brit Bein Abtarim. There's and do they ever catch up on any of the information on what's going on? Are there any, do they get together for Thanksgiving? Come on. Is there any type of an interaction there between, and what do they know about what's going on in Bereshit? But notice, because we do notice something, God is not part of the story. And that itself, to me, is really interesting because it doesn't have to be that way. And even when Balaam brings God into the story, they kick him right out of the story, and they're really not interested in this. Let's just go on a little bit more. We'll see how far we get with this. That's not what I'm trying to say. I'll tell you exactly what I'm trying to say soon. Okay, let's go back. They come back to Balaam and they say that he refuses to go. More important, more ministers. Don't refuse. Now, by the way, he's never refused, which means again they just completely ignored. I love the communication over here. Because nobody's listening to what anyone else has to say. Everyone's just going on with what they have to say. I'm going to give you a lot. Anything you say we're going to do. Curse for me these people. Again, now he's negotiating. Give me as much gold and silver. I still couldn't go. It's Pi Hashem Elokai. So that itself is interesting. He calls him Hashem Elokai. He brought up the money. Right. Right. Vatashuvuna bazeh ki atem alay gam atem alayla ve'da'a ma Yosef Hashem daber elai. I'm going to hear what God has to say to me. By the way, God already has said to him things that he's forgotten to say, and that is, don't go with them. Why? And don't curse them. Why? Because they're blessed, and all that he's left out. V'yavo Elokim el Balaam laila v'yomer lo im lukro lecha bo anashim kum lechitam. Now, God is engaging Balaam based upon his web of half-truths. If they've come in order to call for you, but the only reason they're doing that is because he hasn't told them the rest of what he needed to say, then go. Which means what God did is the same way that Bilam does not answer God precisely, and he does not communicate precisely. So now God, mamash, midah keneged midah, he speaks to Bilam the same way that Bilam speaks to others. And it's kind of like this, but of course that's not why they're here. They're not here for him. They're here for him to curse. Because he left, look what he left out. He left out what Bilam left out, is I can't curse them. Of course, they're not one, they're not allowed to curse them, and two, they're blessed, which means, they only came for you? No, that's not why they came. They came for you to curse. So therefore, he gets up and he thinks that he has permission. But he doesn't have permission because he's already told that he can't do this. Right? Not what I say to you, say, ta'aseh, do. It's also interesting. Which of course, because you don't understand why is God upset. God's upset because he didn't tell him to go. But Bilam, as we see, does what he wants, how he wants, and so on. I'm going to skip the part with the donkey, even though I had great expectations of getting there. I do want to go towards the very end when he gets there. After the whole interaction with Malach Hashem and so on, he does switch a little bit as we get to Pasuk, let's say at the end of the page, Lamed Chet, Pasuk Lamed Chet, the end for last line. V'yomid Balaam el Balak, hine bati elech ata hayuchal uchal daber mu'uma, hadavar asher yasim Elokim b'fi oto adaber. What Elokim says to me, I will say. V'yelech Balak in Balak, v'yavo kiryat chutzot, v'yizbach Balak bakar. Balak brings offerings, v'tzon v'yishlach Balaam zerem mito, v'yobok v'yikach Balak et Balaam, v'yaleu bamot Baal, v'yaram yisham k'tzei ha'am. So look at this. They're worshiping Baal. I hope you appreciate this, because Baal is going to come up again towards the end of the Parsha. They're worshiping Baal. Bilam is there worshiping. So as much as Bilam likes to say that I only serve God, God and so on, I kind of wonder about his absolute devotion to monotheism when he's willing to get into a Baal barbecue over here. And it doesn't seem to be something which troubles him greatly. And We'll just notice this. Okay, I already hinted at this around 7 times, so let's pay attention to a couple of things. Source number 2 is the Brit Ben Abtarim. Brit Ben Abtarim lays out the plan for the Jews for the next 400 years, right? We have a 400-year plan. And, right, it's part of the protocols of the Elders of Zion. But the first one is from God, and that is, Ki ger yezarcha be'eretz lo lahem. And that includes, right, according to Chazal, that includes from this day. Avram is in a land which isn't his. The proof is he has a very hard time finding a place to bury his wife. He finds a very hard time finding a wife for his son. Why? Because this is not their land. They're strangers in this land. Right? You have to read the pasuk properly. Right? Vayomer Avram Yodei Tedakir Kiger Yezarcha Be'eretz Lo Lahem Vavduva Nu Otam. And that's where that Nachne is. Abamot Shana then goes back and ratifies that entire thing, including Geria Zarcha Be'eretz Lo Lahem, which means they're going to be strangers for 400 years, and within those 400 years will take slavery as well, which means it doesn't really say here the slavery has to be 400 years, but it goes on that whole clause. V'gam et hagoy asher yavodu dan anochi, and v'yetzev ruchush gadol, v'tatovotecha, then pasuk tetzayin, v'dur v'yeshuvu hena, ki lo shalem avon ha'emori ad hena. Because the Emori, remember, that's how we started our story today? Because the Emori, their sins will not be completed until that time. And why the Emori are singled out, especially when you read a couple of verses later, then the sun rises and sets and whatever, move on. And it says, Bayomahu karat Hashem et Avram brit lemor lezar acha, which is really interesting, because who are the Zerah of Avram? Lizar acha natati et haaretz hazot minahar Mitzrayim adnar hagadol nahar prat. Talk about Eretz Yisrael Hashlema. Okay, this is extremely expansive. Eta keni ve'eta One second. In our pride. Et hakeni ve'et haknizi ve'et hakadmoni ve'et hachiti ve'et haprizi ve'et hariphaim ve'et ha'ma'ori ve'et haknani ve'et hagirgashi ve'et hayevusi. I'm giving all of this land, I'm giving to them. And of course, over here, again, there's a common denominator between all of them, right? All of these people that are going to be displaced. And you have a little bit of an issue. Why were the Emori mentioned back in Pasuk Tet Zayin as opposed to all of these other nations? And on top of all of that, what about this really expansive area that was mentioned? If you look at source number 3, which goes back to the verses, this is after the flood. We're told of the children of Noach, Uvnei Cham, right? We have Shem, Cham, Uyafet, and that's one of the things that you need to pay attention to throughout Sefer Bamidbar is Shem, Cham, V'Yafet. Any nation you meet, that has to be your first question. Who are they from? Are these people from Shem? Or these people from Cham, or these people from Yafet? And the reality is, we don't care that much about Yafet, but already then we were told that their Cham has been singled out, and Canaan has been singled out. But let's just follow Canaan for a second. Back in source number 3, V'nei Cham, Kush, Mitzrayim, Put, Uknan. So Cham has all these kids. One of them is Mitzrayim, that we pay attention to, and Canaan. But Canaan was the younger one, the one who was cursed. Uknan yilad et Sidon, Becharo, ve'et Chet. Remember B'nei Chet? Avram has these interactions with B'nei Chet. Ve'et Yevusi, ve'et Emori, ve'et Girgashi. Who are all these people? Ve'et Chivi, ve'et Ariki, ve'et Sinai, ve'et Ravidi, ve'et Tzmidi, ve'et Chamati. Right? All of these are mimishpachat ha'knaani, which means that when we talk about Knan, we're talking about all of these people that sometimes are, and one of them is Emori. The Emori are one of the children of Canaan, so that then becomes interesting, because when we say that God gave us Eretz Canaan, it means Eretz Canaan, including all of these children of Canaan who own all of these places. Now, the Chizkuni writes, and Rav David Tzvi Hoffman follows this 1,000 years later, not quite, 700 years later. Avona Emori, Katav Emori, Yoter Mishar Emori, Lefisha Avram Yoshev Balei Mamre Emori. That why did it say Emori? Where Avram was at that particular moment. That's where he lived. The Emek Davar, the Netziv, gives slightly different answer. Avona Marisha who ikar be'eretz Yisrael b'oto sha'a shall be at haaretz, be Yisrael haaretz, which means that one says that God is speaking, as it were, b'lashon b'nei Adam of Avraham at that moment, and one is that God is speaking b'lashon b'nei Adam when Am Yisrael is going to come into Eretz Yisrael. So what's the focus then, Marie? We essentially have two different ways of looking at this. Source number 6 is where we go back to the initial that you will be whoever blesses you will be blessed, whoever curses you will be cursed. Right? And Avram goes over to Shechem, and by the way, and all of this will become quite important. And then God promises the land. Now, the background, remember we said that we needed to get to the Archbishop. Where's the Archbishop going to be introduced? At the very end of source 7, the last part will say, so all of that told us is that where are they? They're someplace in the area of Moab on the other side of the Yarden. But now, the background for all of this. The background is source number 7. Perikov Aleph is, of course, the background for Perikov Bet. And here we're told that the Knaani, now remember I told you that there's one way to understand all of this. What is it? Who are you? Abraham was told that his descendants are going to receive all of this land. One of the things that we need to know is that Am Yisrael never receives all of this land. But Avraham is promised all of this land. So if that sounds somewhat confusing, let's note Avraham has other children. I mean, just for example, when Esav picks up and leaves the land of Israel and leaves Yaakov behind, and he then takes Har Seir and so on, does he have a right to that land? And the answer is yes. And that was part of the intrigue that takes place. As Am Yisrael comes to that land, they say, no, don't come here. And they're not given permission to fight. Again, Just keep this in mind, and all of Sefer Bamidbar will now make sense. The people that we are not permitted to fight with are the people who are descendants of Shem, who are within the larger Avram family. The people who we are permitted and commanded to fight with are the people who are not supposed to be there, who are going to be the children of Kahn. It all goes back to those initial chapters in Bereshit. Now, there's going to be one or two twists along the way over here. If you want, one of them is going to be right back in Bereshit, where Moab and Midian end up having a war and end up having a fight over land. So what happens to that piece of land? That's interesting, but for a separate reason. Part of why that's brought is to show is that they don't get along with one another, but Jews have a wonderful way of bringing world peace, and that is that we can bring together people who don't like us, and they suddenly get along. Okay, that's a side problem. The other problem is what's going to be introduced over here in source number 7, Parakaf Aleph. V'yishma Knaani, okay, now we have to keep in mind, the Knaani, Melech Arad, Yoshev and Egi Kiva Yisrael, Derech Hatarim V'Chem Yisrael, V'yesh Mimenu Shevi, V'yidar Yisrael Nedur LaHashem. Now this is interesting because Chazal are actually going to claim, at least some voices in Chazal, this is not really Canaan at all, this is Amalek. Because Amalek is in the Negev. By the way, all of that makes it more complicated in terms of my Shem versus Cham division. But now Amalek is a separate category because we have a command to fight against Amalek. But I'm just saying Amalek is more complicated. But at face value, this is the Knaani. We end up having people who are captured, and then V'yidor Yisrael Nedur LaHashem, V'yishma Hashem B'kol Yisrael, we go back to our Yaakov personality, the Kol Yaakov. We pray to God, and we're victorious. And just to read a little bit more here, that's Pasuk Yud Aleph, and Misham Nesu B'Nachal Zered. We'll skip Pasuk Yud Gimel. Misham Nesu B'Chnu B'Ever Arnon Asher B'Medra Yotzei Gvul Emori Ki Arnon Gvul Moav Bein Moab u'Bein Emori. So they get to a place which is by the border between Moab and Emori. Now, what's the difference in Moab and Emori? The Emori are from Canaan. The Emori are part of Bnei Kahn. On the other hand, the people from Moab are from Lod, and therefore they're from Shem. Which means, and just like Esav leaves to make room for Yaakov, Lod left to make room for Avraham. And we have every reason to believe and to expect that because of those gestures, they actually have a right to the land. But I'm saying more than that. That's part of what God promises to Avraham, which means when God promises Avraham land, it's including land to solve problems. Which means we have a problem over here, so that's land as well, and therefore they're able to take land. But what happens then? Okay, Pasuk of Vayishlach Yisrael Malachim El Sichon Melech Emori. Right? Now, Emori again is going to be a problem. Let us course by the land. Right? Adasher Navor Gvulecha. V'lo natan Sichon et Yisrael Avor Gvulo. V'yasov Sichon et Kol Amo. V'yitzei lekrat Yisrael Midbar. V'yitzei Yatzav V'yelachem Yisrael. V'yakei Yisrael Afi Charev. V'yirash et Artzo. V'yirash is really an interesting word because V'yirash means inheritance. You can only inherit something which you own. So now, what in the world just now happened? This land is included within the land that was promised to Avram Avinu. But it wasn't necessarily the land that was promised to Bnei Yisrael. What happens is that when he does not let them pass by, because they're on the way to what I'll call right now Eretz Yisrael proper, what happens then is Vayirash. Now they take. Why Vayirash? Because this land was promised to Avram. Et Artzo me'arnon al Yabok al b'nei Amon ki az gvul b'nei Amon v'yikach zor kol ha'arim ha'ela v'yeshev zor b'kol ha'rei Amori b'cheshbon u'b'chol b'notel ki cheshbon ir Sichon melech Amorihi v'hu nilcham b'melech Moav harishon v'yikach et kol Artzo miyado ad Arnon. Now that just got more interesting because who did this land really belong to? This land belonged to Moab. But what happened to Moab? Moab lost the land to the Emori. Now when Moab loses the land to Emori, when Emori have it, Now Am Yisrael have the right to go and fight against them. When Moab has it, then at that point they don't necessarily have the right to fight against it. Which means if Moab would have known their biblical stories a little bit better, then they would have known that there's no threat whatsoever from Am Yisrael, because Am Yisrael is going to go right back to the place that they need to get to, because that's what their mandate is. On the other hand, when they start trying to gather together this whole confederation of people, so again, Midian, they should know very well that they're not part of this, because again, yes, Avram was promised a whole bunch of that, which essentially creates a potential for Am Yisrael to take land, as opposed to the land which they are directly promised. And I'm going to tell you something. I made all of this very simple, but I can assure you that one of the most complicated things that I've ever tried to figure out was looking at all the times that God promises things to Abraham and subsequently, and then look at maps and try to figure out what in the world is going on. And you have a description like this of what I call this expansive place, and that, as far as I'm concerned, is the solution. Abraham is promised the expansive place, but Am Yisrael is not necessarily promised that same expansive place. But the word Yirash is really interesting over here. Once we legitimately take it, they go to war against us, and we take that land then becomes our land. I'm not talking about politics today, right? At least not directly.
In other words, it's meant to be.
I know that Avraham is okay, let's put it this way. B'nai Shem have the right to be in this area. The children of Ham don't have the right to be in this area. The children of Ham at a certain point are all going to be chased away, but what happens when one of the children of Ham takes away some of the land from some of the children of Shem, and then a different one of the children of Shem, Bnei Israel, come and they take this, so at that point, that's called a Yerusha, because that's what was promised to Abraham. So what I just now did is I just now solved all of the background issues over here, but again, this is what's interesting in all of this, is that they seem to want to completely ignore who these people are. They want to take God out of the story. Of course, if you take God out of the story, then there's no longer issues of inheritance, there's no longer issues of a promise, there's no longer issues of anything which is special over here, and that's very much part of their agenda. If you take God out of the stories, then what right does Am Yisrael have to this area? But what happens when you put things back within the context of Sefer Bereshit? That's what I said from the beginning, is that whatever's taking place over here seems to be very much a lack of appreciation of Sefer Bereshit. They're not paying attention to what's happening in Sefer Bereshit, what was promised in Sefer Bereshit, what God says the future is. Part of the future is that the Avon HaEmori. The Emori are the ones who are going to mess up. And they did. One of the things that they do is that they decide that they're going to go and fight. And they're going to go and fight, and that gave Am Yisrael permission to take that land. And all of that land is going to end up being taken. And what's going to happen also is Moab wants to go to war. Midian wants to go to war. So what's going to happen is that once those wars are, again, we're not told to go and to fight with any of them, but once it becomes defensive, then at that point everything changes here along the way. I have so much more to say about the Parsha, and there was what to say about the donkey, and there was what to say about what Balaam says, and I knew that once I started going slowly, verse by verse, that we would be in trouble, but maybe the part of the message is, I said from the beginning that different people have different narratives, and some people's narratives are based upon very limited understanding of what they see in front of them in that particular moment, and sometimes a narrative based upon something which goes back, or something which is biblical, or something goes back historical. And over here, the ignoring or the twisting of the biblical story is what allows Moab and then allows Midian. And Midian backs away until Am Yisrael starts doing Avodah Zarah. Then Midian says, they're speaking our language, and now Midian can suddenly come back into the story. But Midian seems to know quite well that this is not going to work out. It's also interesting. There's a Rashi, you'll find it here in these pages, that when I read that pasuk about the Knani attacking, so it's really Amalek. So it says that they do that so that Am Yisrael would not be able to pray efficiently, because remember that we do have this Kol Yaakov, we do have this ability to pray, but so therefore if they pray, because they pray to defeat Canaan, but they're not Canaan, they're really Amalek, and therefore this power of prayer seems to be, or the power to speak, or the power for us to be able to reach out to God is interesting, because again, you go with a bit of a Kal V'chomer. If Balaam is able to say things and they're going to be able to come to fruition, then certainly when we're able to So then we're able to pray, then they should be able to come to fruition. I do want to say halacha l'maisa. There's a halacha which Tosfot paskins based upon Bilam. It's actually Tosfot only says it, and the Psak halacha, various achronim, but I'll quote the Aruch HaShulchan. So when it comes to Sosman Kriyat Shema, Sosman Tefillah, right? So Sosman Kriyat Shema, let's say this week, I'm guessing, is 9:13 this week, more or less. And you have to finish Shema by that point? You have to start Shema by that point. So there's a Tosfot that says that, based on the Gemara, it says that Bilam knew that there was 1 second in the day. And so Tosfot says, how much can you say in that 1 second? So the first answer of Tosfot says, Kaleim, eradicate, get rid of them. Second answer of Tosfot is no. You have to start saying it by then, but then once you start on time, then it's fine. So the Aruch HaShulchan uses this and says, therefore, when it comes to Sof Zman Tefillah, you just have to start by Sof Zman Tefillah. You don't have to finish the prayer by Sof Zman Tefillah. There's all, Rav Ovadia has a long tshuva based upon this in terms of other things. Like, let's say you started Kiddush Levana, and you could see the moon, and then the moon gets covered up. He says that's good enough as well. And there's all kinds of, there's a Matzah Shekel that talks about you daven in a shul with a minyan, and the minyan leaves. You're the only one left. He says it still has a din of Tefillah B'tzibor, because it's what you started with, and it doesn't go on what you ended. I'm saying all of this comes out being this remnant of a halacha that comes from Bilam, and essentially the argument is that if God is willing to, based upon the beginning of something, in order to allow a curse to take place theoretically, but he frustrated and stopped that curse, then certainly alachat kama v'chama that God should allow the power of good to be able to be victorious. There's Yerushalmi that brings proof. Anybody wants to, I collected on 15 pages of sources on this, and if anybody's interested, then I'm willing to share. Have a good Shabbos.